Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today in this module we are going to talk about ecological thinkers, and the thinker that we are going to talk about today is someone whom you have known as Charles Darwin. Now Darwin never called or described himself as an ecologist, and he rather preferred to be called a naturalist, yet he anticipated the ways ecologists work, both in his theories and methods. So let us see how in this module Kaushik Dasgupta looks at Darwin's work as being an ecological thinker. Darwin is not always seen as an ecological thinker. He himself did not like the term ecology. However, the thinker who gave us the theory of evolution anticipated many of the methods of modern day ecologists. This module tries to understand the ecological underpinning of Darwin's thoughts by looking at his early influences, his sojourn on the HMS Beagle, and his ideological moorings. It then tries to answer if Darwin can be called an ecologist. This module ends by discussing an important fallout of Darwinism, social Darwinism, that legitimized colonialism and racial theories. The early influences. Charles Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, England on February 12, 1809. The country town near the Welsh border was untouched yet by the Industrial Revolution. Charles was the fifth of 6 children of Dr. R.W. Darwin, a physician, and Susanna, who died when Charles was only 8 years old. Darwin's family had a long line of scientists. Grandfather Erasmus Darwin was a formidable botanist, inventor, and a polymath. He was also a campaigner against slavery. His maternal grandmother, Josiah Wedgwood, a famous Chinaware manufacturer, was also a leading campaigner against racism. Wedgwood, in fact, designed the logo of the anti-slavery movement, a seal featuring a slave of African origin kneeling and the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Darwin's sisters and cousins were also passionate campaigners against slavery, and his family's political leanings left a deep impact on the young Charles. In 1825, when he was 16, Darwin enrolled at Edinburgh University. Darwin's father wanted his 5th child to follow in his footsteps and become a physician, but the sight of blood made young Charles uneasy. He then enrolled himself at Christ College in Cambridge, but his short spell as a medical student was to provide Darwin one of his formative influences. He learned the art of taxidermy from a freed slave. Edinburgh University, ironically, was in those days the hotbed of racial science, dedicated to defining the races and labeling some of them as inferior. Phrenology, which ascribed human intellect to shape of skulls, was a major intellectual trend. People were seeing shapes in human skulls and deciding that defined racially unique characteristics. Young Charles revolted at the thought. Once his son had enrolled at Cambridge, R.W. Darwin suggested that young Charles study to become a priest. But the young Darwin was to come under the influence of John Stephen Henslow, the Regius Professor of Botany at Cambridge. Henslow was a popular teacher, and Erasmus Alvary Darwin, Charles's elder brother, would regale him with tales of botany professor's brilliance. Charles Darwin was studying for a degree in theology and the classic, but he was soon drawn towards Henslow. The Regius Professor of Botany's popularity owed much to his teaching methods. Henslow, unlike his contemporaries, was not a scientist who spent time in laboratories. He also did not believe in spoon-feeding his students. Henslow encouraged his students to make observations in gardens and fields. Darwin managed to secure an invitation to one of Henslow's field trips and very soon became a regular on the trips, acquiring the reputation as the man who walks with the Henslow. The botanist professor's insistence on field visits left a deep impression on Darwin. After Darwin gave his final examination in 1831, Henslow persuaded him to begin studying geology and made arrangements for him to become an apprentice of the renowned paleontologist Adam Sedgwick. On a geographical excursion to North Wales, the paleologist was to teach Darwin how to read maps and to collect and describe specimens. While Darwin was apprenticing with Sedgwick, Henslow received a letter informing him that Robert Fitzroy, a scientist and a sailor, was looking for a companion on a planned 2-year trip to survey South America aboard HMS Beagle. Henslow thought the opportunity was perfect for young Darwin and recommended him to Fitzroy. The sailor scientist was reluctant initially. Darwin's nose seemed to work against him. Fitzroy was a passionate believer of phrenology and suspected that Darwin's nose revealed a constitution too weak for an extended voyage. But Darwin persuaded Fitzroy that my nose had spoken falsely, and the captain relented. In December 1831, Darwin set sail for South America. It was actually the first leg of a landmark 5-year circumnavigation of the world. On HMS Beagle, over the course of the trip, Darwin used the methods he had learned from Henslow and Sedgwick to collect a variety of natural specimens, including birds, plants, and fossils. Through hands-on research and experiments, he had the opportunity to closely observe principles of botany, geology, and zoology. The Pacific Islands and Galapagos archipelago were of particular interest to Darwin, as was South America. Darwin corresponded with his mentor as much as the rudimentary postal system of his time would allow. He would dispatch his collection of scientific samples to Henslow, who saw it that they were passed on to the appropriate experts for analysis, and took it upon himself to publish extracts of Darwin's letters in respectable scientific journals. While his trip aboard HMS Beagle was intellectually stimulating, the sojourn was not without trouble for Darwin. Life on the vessel was uncomfortable, and in the first 3 weeks of the voyage, Darwin was struck by a debilitating bout of seasickness. Peace on the Beagle was very often disturbed due to fearsome arguments between Darwin and Fitzroy, an ardent supporter of slavery. But the two remained friends nevertheless, and his revulsion at slavery, notwithstanding, Darwin described Roy as one of the most noble I have ever known. The sailor scientist presented Darwin with the first volume of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. The gift was a major turning point in Darwin's life. Over the voyage, Darwin was converted to the Lyellian view of nature as one undergoing slow and gradual change. He now believed that the Earth's surface was constantly oscillating in responses to forces of uplift counterbalanced by subsidence elsewhere. The land in one part of the world, as Andes say, was rising from beneath the waves, even as the coral-encircled extinct volcanoes of the South Pacific were sinking below them. By the end of 5-year voyage, Darwin was convinced that the sea was the dominant force of erosion, and he viewed landscapes such as the Blue Mountains of Australia and the Lochs of Scotland as scenery sculpted by the sea before those countries had risen above it. We now know, and Darwin came painfully to realize with the advent of glacial theory in the 1840s, that ice and rainwater could be just as, if not more powerful, given enough time. Darwin returned to England in 1836 and 2 years later married his cousin Emma Wedgwood. In 1842, the young couple moved to a house in Down, a small village in Kent. The move was dictated by Darwin's ill health. He was ailed with intestinal ailments for the rest of his life and would often be struck by nausea and severe fatigue. And he was to be an infrequent visitor to London in the coming years. The 5-year sojourn on HMS Beagle affected Darwin's health for the rest of his life, but he was to use the periods of ill health productively, in deep contemplation, very often over what he saw during the trip. Ideological moorings. Upon his return to England, Darwin began to write up his findings in the Journal of Researchers, published as part of Fitzroy's larger narratives, and later edited into the Zoology of the Voyage of the Beagle. In 1837, Darwin was to read out the abstract of his first scientific paper, Coral Reef, before the Geological Society. Later that year, he read another paper on the formation of mold. The paper contained gems of his ideas on earthworms, the subject of his last book, the formation of vegetable mold through the action of worms, with observation on their habits. The trip Aboard HMS Beagle made Darwin realize his calling. Theology was not for him. Darwin had left England a devout Christian, but 2 years after his return he gave up Christianity, saying he no longer required a supernatural watchmaker. But with his wife and several other family members remaining devout Christians, Darwin chose to be careful about his religious views, describing himself rather as an agnostic. The mystery of the beginnings of all things is insoluble, and I must remain an agnostic, he said. Darwin, however, remained ambivalent about religion. Though he renounced religion, he remained a lifelong member of St. Mary's Church in Down, England. He served on its parish council and was a close friend of the vicar, Reverend John Brodie Innes. Francis Darwin writes that in his published work, his father was reticent on the matter of religion, and what he has left on the subject was not written with a view to publication. Unquote. Darwin shrank from wounding the conservative Anglican dons, and in a letter to one Dr. F.E. Abbott, he writes that, I quote, he was influenced by the consciousness that a man ought not to publish on a subject to which he has not given special continuous thought. Unquote. Besides, Darwin's mentors, Henslow and Sedgwick, held positions in the church, leading Darwin to be cautious about his views on religion. Moreover, the reticent Darwin was up against the current beliefs. Most people during Darwin's time held the divine as the creator and linchpin of all life on earth. They believed immutability was the essential characteristic of the world. The natural world had been created by the divine force in more or less the form they appeared then. If there was any change, it was seasonal or cyclical. All creatures had a predestined place, and they were designed to fit in the world. The earliest geological research in the late 18th and early 19th century cast doubts over such a worldview. They showed evidence of vast upheavals in the Earth's history. The discovery of fossils indicated that organisms were very different from the current ones. A picture of change and relatedness was emerging, and scientists were beginning to show that species had changed over time. In 1838, Darwin read Robert Malthus's essay on the principles of population. The central theme of Malthus's work was that population growth would always overpower food supply growth, creating perpetual states of hunger, disease, and struggle. Malthus, like many of his contemporaries, accorded a prime role to religion. An ordained minister, he believed that disease and hunger were divine instruments that kept populations from exploding. Darwin was, however, not drawn to aspects of Malthus's theory. Indeed, he considered that some of the competitors in the perpetual struggle postulated by Malthus would be better equipped to survive. The ones less adept would perish, leaving only those with desirable traits. The seeds of the theory of evolution were sown. But Darwin had to hold back. His caution had to do with the release in 1844 of a 400-page book, Vestiges of Natural History of Creation. The book began by describing the formation of the solar system. It traced the origins of plant and animal life and went on to detail the genesis of humankind. It was a history of life on earth, stripped of any divine attachment. The book appeared initially the work of an anonymous author. It sold remarkably 20,000 copies in a decade. Queen Victoria raved over it. So did physicist David Webster. Other readers included Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Disraeli, Alfred Tennyson, and John Stuart Mill. But there were critics too. Darwin's mentor Sedgwick slammed the book. In an 85-page review, the paleontologist described this anti-biblical theory of life on Earth as, I quote, a grand delusion under the influence of serpent coils of false philosophy, unquote. Darwin shrank from hurting the conservative establishments. Even though he had much more evidence for his theory than the then anonymous author, revealed several decades later as the publisher Robert Chambers. At the same time, though, he balked at the racial theories of his time. The deeply racist Anthropological Society of London stepped up its activity in the run-up to the American Civil War. Darwin's biographers, Adrian Desmond and James Moore, whose book Darwin's Sacred Cause, note that this was the last straw for the reticent scientist to show that human beings in all their variety descended from a common ancestor Darwin needed to demonstrate similar variation in other creatures. He turned to the pigeons, all of whose many variants descended from the same source, the rock dove. The pigeons would form the starting point of on the origin of species. It was published in 1859. In the 1850s, there was a debate over whether or not all pigeon breeds descended from one stock. Most naturalists believed that they were, while pigeon breeders believed they were descended from probably 7 or 8 species. By tracing the various breeds to one ancestor, Darwin showed two things. First, a socially controversial view at the time, when the origin of divine theory of life was preponderant, was that humans were responsible for creating vastly different varieties of the same species. The selective breeding was designed to produce the most desirable characteristics in the birds, a process he referred to as artificial selection. Second, and more importantly, this study of artificial selection helped Darwin arrive at his theory of evolution. If humans could create this degree of variation in a few hundred generations, Darwin reasoned that nature, acting over a much longer period, could have worked diverse life forms on the earth. According to this theory of natural selection, small variations between organisms would give some advantages in the struggle for existence. These relatively stronger individuals would produce more offsprings, who would then inherit their parents' advantages. But Darwin did not look at the living world in isolation. His apprenticeship with Henslow and Sedgwick and his reading of Malthus and Lyell had alerted him to the geological world. He also knew that the environment would always be changing. That made him postulate natural selection as a perpetual process, as organisms adapt to the natural world and in turn leave their imprint on it, though Darwin was not always explicit about this. Nevertheless, this is remarkably akin to the concept of ecological footprint that modern day ecologists use. It makes us ask if Darwin was an ecologist. Let's look Darwin as an early ecologist. Darwin's reliance on the complex interactions between the different elements of the natural world have led many to call him one of the modern times' early ecologists. The word ecologist, though, was not coined when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. Darwin himself described him as a naturalist. But what is, in a word? In many ways, Darwin anticipated the methods of modern ecologists. He distinguished himself from his predecessors and several of his contemporaries by drawing attention to the complex web of relations between the natural and living creatures. Several sections on the species of origin of species bear striking similarities with the way modern ecologists think. In one of them, Darwin describes an enclosure in Surrey. Midway through the description, he wonders how fir trees could have proliferated in the enclosure. Darwin's answer, the exclusion of cattle that graze on seedlings. This is followed by a discussion on cattle, horses, and dogs in Paraguay. Darwin argues that the animals never went feral in a religion Paraguay, while they did so a few hundred kilometers away, owed to their populations being kept in check by flies. Insectivores fed on these flies, and they in turn were food for larger birds. Any changes in this delicate balance of animal life could lead to cattle, dogs, and horses turning feral. Darwin surmised. He may or may not have been right. Darwin's ways of looking at the natural world seem remarkably close to that of modern ecologists. Darwin never used the term ecosystem, yet his understanding of the links between different creatures and the geological world strikes a chord with the way modern ecologists deploy the term. Darwin's correspondences also throw a great deal of light on his methods. These are of utility to not just scientists but also ecologists. We come to know about his fascination for earthworms, for example. People in the English countryside loved earthworms. They were fishing baits. They were also useful in gardens. When Darwin was recuperating after the tiring 5-year trip on HMS Beagle, his uncle and later father-in-law, Jos Wedgwood, showed him a patch in his garden where he had spread ash and lime several years ago. Darwin was struck by how soil burrowed out by earthworms had buried the substances. After setting up home in Kent, Darwin began a series of earthworm experiments. Over the next 40 years or so, Darwin would study earthworms in his laboratory and his extensive garden. He fed the worms, exposed their sensitivity to light, and even had music played to them. He recorded they preferred wild cherry and carrots and preferred fat to raw meat. Once he was done with his preoccupations over the origin of species, Darwin spent considerable time ruminating on the intelligence of earthworms. He observed earthworms pull leaves into their burrows, plugging openings to keep out the chilled air. He also conducted bizarre experiments, like asking his son to play the bassoon to the worms. The reactions were to convince him that the creatures did not have a musical ear. At most times, however, Darwin's insights into earthworms were eye-opening, and they continue to fascinate soil scientists, botanists, agricultural scientists, and ecologists. He wrote in the formation of vegetable mold through the action of worms with observations on their habits, and I quote, "The plough is one of the most ancient and most valuable of man's inventions, but long before he existed, the land was in fact regularly ploughed and still continues to be thus ploughed by the earthworms. It may be doubted whether there are many other animals which have played so important a part in the history of the world as have these lowly organized creatures. Some other animals, however, still more lowly organized, namely corals, have done far more conspicuous work in having constructed innumerable reefs and the islands in the great oceans, but these are almost confined to the tropical zones." Unquote. The book was published in 1881, a few months before Darwin's death. Although Darwin himself described it as a small work, the formation of vegetable mold became a bestseller of sorts, doing much better than the origin of species in its first print run. Much of the book's initial success, though, owed to the part where Darwin put the worms to scrutiny to understand if they were intelligent creatures. Over the years, it was neglected by soil scientists. As agriculture came to be dominated by chemical processes, biochemical processes described in the formation of vegetable mold were ignored. Zoologists, though, continued to read the book, and with environment becoming a concern from the last 3 decades of the 20th century, the formation was back in favor as a new generation learned the value of earthworms. Was Darwin a forebear of ecology then? The answer is not straightforward. What we can say, though, is Darwin's work was pivotal, and in many ways than one, in establishing the modern field of ecology. Though Darwin described himself as a natural scientist, his experiments challenging the old, purely observational tradition of natural history. But at the same time, Darwin also challenged the high-flung laboratory science and demonstrated that field-based experiments could be highly sophisticated. More importantly, Darwin broke down the rigid barriers between disciplines and anticipated the ecological approach of combining insights from geological and natural sciences to unravel the complex web of life. Ecology and social Darwinism. In 1866, the German scientist and theorist Ernst Haeckel defined ecology. He says, and I quote, "By ecology we mean the whole sciences of the relations of the organism to the environment, including, in the broad sense, all the conditions of existence." Unquote. The term first appeared in English in E. Ray Lancaster's translation of Haeckel's History of Creation in 1876. Though Darwin had never used the term ecologist, Haeckel called origin of species as the primary inspiration for his description of the field he called ecology. And I quote, "Ecology is the study of all those complex interrelations referred to by Darwin as the conditions of the struggle for existence." Unquote. He remarked in a lecture. Haeckel mailed Darwin a copy of the book. The reaction was mixed. Darwin thought Haeckel's work was important and wrote to the German theorist to say that, I quote, "I am delighted that distinguished naturalist should confirm and expound my views, and I can clearly see that you are one of the few who clearly understands natural selection." Unquote. Darwin, however, was not very impressed with the German scientist coining the new term, ecology. In a letter to his friend, the scientist T. H. Huxley, Darwin wrote, and I quote, "He seems to have a passion for defining, I dare say very well, and for coining new words. The number of new words is something dreadful." Unquote. Unlike his sagely intellectual mentor, Haeckel is a controversial figure. His appropriation of Darwin's theory is seen as travesty, and Haeckel is regarded as the progenitor of that unholy variant of Darwinism, social Darwinism. Social Darwinism essentially holds that aggression is a key instinct of all animals, including humans. Social Darwinists argue that this inherent attribute of all living creatures, militates against cooperation. Haeckel's thought developed along these lines. He perceived a close relation between ecology and philosophy. His own philosophical system was monism, which asserted that the unity of all, the animating of all matter, and the inseparability of mental power and the corporeal substance. Unquote. Haeckel tirelessly reminded his readers that human beings were governed by the same laws that ruled the natural universe. He castigated the anthropocentric view of the universe and insisted that, as I quote, our mother nature is a mere speck in the sunbeam of the universe, so a man is protoplasm in the perishable framework of organic nature. Unquote. Haeckel would at times try to understand social phenomena through biological lenses. For example, he claimed that, and I quote, we can arrive at the correct knowledge of the social body, the state, through the structure and life of the individuals who compose it and the cells which they are in turn composed of. Unquote. Social division of labor was akin to the division of labor in the natural world. It was product of the struggle for existence. He concluded that the whole history of nations, or quote, what is called universal theory and universal history, must be explicable by the means of natural selection. Unquote. For many, this meant a call to racism again. This was an unholy appropriation of Darwin's theory of natural selection. It meant that the species which survived the struggle were quote unquote higher than others, and by extension, some groups of human beings were more advanced than others. In the history of creation, Haeckel argued that all organic individuals, though seemingly alike, are unequal from birth. The original differences were exacerbated due to adaptation during the life cycle and transmitted to progeny, thus producing greater degrees of differentiation through time. Unquote. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, Haeckel described military selection, in which the bravest and brightest were slaughtered on the fields of battle, while the weak and cowardly were left to man the bedrooms and thereby perpetuate their low moral character. For Haeckel's later day detractors like the historian Daniel Gassman and the scientist Stephen Jay Gould, all this was a clear enunciation of the superiority of some races. Haeckel divided humanity in 12 races and 36 species on basis of differences in hair type and speech. These races could be arranged in hierarchy according to their degree of proximity to apes. So, was Darwin complicit in social Darwinism? Most critics absolve Darwin from the regressive variant of his theory. Many critics of social Darwinism have pointed the concept is a pernicious appropriation of Darwin's theory. Although human beings are products of evolution and are descended from apes, that doesn't mean that their social structure must function according to the survival of the fittest. Social Darwinism doesn't grasp the kernel of evolution. Evolution doesn't necessarily mean things improve for the best, nor is it strength and power that are automatically desirable, but rather flexibility. The critics of social Darwinism point out that Darwin never used a phrase commonly ascribed to him, survival of the fittest. Did Darwin anticipate some of the pernicious effects of his theory? Darwin was ambivalent about the then current trend of recognizing some races as high and some as low. At times he went with the trend, but he abhorred slavery and detested phrenology. That meant that though he recognized that some races were high and some low, this did not mean less than human treatment had to be meted out to those who were deemed low. Darwin's abolitionist beliefs were strongly confirmed when visiting the slave countries of South America on the Beagle in early 1830s. Later, he longed for the defeat of the slave-holding southern states during the American Civil War. Social Darwinism was used to legitimize colonialism as an expression of the notion that in the struggle of existence, the stronger party has the right to overcome the weaker party and claim territory. Haeckel's ecological ideas were popular among the Nazis. Ecologists have, however, rarely associated with the men who gave their discipline its name. They have a somewhat different association with his intellectual mentor Darwin, though. They have used his methods, sometimes without acknowledging him. With the current environmental crisis necessitating a multidisciplinary study of the natural world, Darwin's methods have become even more relevant. Darwin's great-grandson, the anthropologist Felix Padel, who works amongst tribal communities in Orissa, has described Darwin's relevance to the ecological movement very aptly. When Padel says, and I quote, "To me, what is most radical and beautiful in Darwin's work was his emphasis on humans' relatedness to nature. That in anatomical structure as well as expression of emotion, animals are our closest relatives. And if you look at the myths of any indigenous society in India or America or everywhere else, there is a strong emphasis on this idea that other species are our close relatives and we should not see ourselves as quote unquote superior."